The nation is mourning the deaths of several women and girls who were murdered by men.
Holding the steak knife that he had been using, he jumped to his feet and rushed at me.
That night when I put in my statement, one of the officers at the police station says, "Oh, you know what? We don't have the time for this."
We know the names of Uyinene Mkhechana, Leandre Jechels, Janika Mallo, Ayaka Gianni, and her 3 little siblings. But we also grieve for the many others who have died at the hands of men.
There was physical abuse, verbal abuse, and emotional abuse.
Violence against women has become more than a national crisis. It is a crime against our common humanity.
South Africa has among the world's highest femicide rates. The likelihood that every girl, woman, and gender non-conforming person has experienced some form of gender abuse is very high. Despite this fact, in the first quarter of 2020, only 3% of GBV cases resulted in convictions. In most cases, poor police investigation comes up as a chief leading contributor to the lack of conviction. This is Him or Me, a podcast series on the experiences of women who have faced abuse and their experiences with the South African criminal justice system. I'm your host, Lele Tutonisi.
My name is Carrie Charles. I'm a survivor of gender-based violence, and I'd say a survivor of the South African justice system. On the evening of 9 February 2007, I shot and killed my former husband, Tim, a man who for many years had abused me, both mentally and physically.
This is the story of a woman who was abused by her husband and killed him in self-defense. For the purpose of protecting the identity of the survivor, Wits Justice Project employed the services of voice artists and changed the name of the parties involved in this case. Carrie Charles married Tim in 1971. The couple moved between provinces before settling in Port Elizabeth in the 1980s.
Had married Tim in 1971, just shortly after I had matriculated. After the marriage, we lived in various towns in the Eastern Cape before finally moving to Port Elizabeth in the 1980s. By then, the relationship had gone to the dogs. Tim worked long hours and was often impatient with the children when he came home. There was always tension in the house. Tim was also very jealous and often accused me of being in relationships with other men. He drank heavily and continuously abused me physically and mentally. He often told me he'd slit my throat with a smile on his face. He locked me in the bedroom, sometimes for hours on end, that I took to keeping food in my room to sustain me on days when I was his prisoner. On one occasion, he locked me in there for an entire weekend.
After 29 years of marriage, Carrie decided to call it quits. The couple divorced in 2002. At this point, Carrie's mental health had deteriorated significantly.
After the divorce, I was admitted to a clinic where I was treated for depression. And even though Tim and I were joint owners of the former matrimonial home, I was advised by my psychiatrist not to return to the house. The initial plan was to convert a section of it into a separate dwelling for me to live.
But Carrie had not landed on her feet and struggled financially. She had to make a decision that went against what she had been advised. Hers was not an uncommon dilemma for women like her, those who are financially dependent on their abuser. This gives abusive men disproportionate power over their victims.
After returning from the clinic, I moved into a flat and Tim paid the rent. Unfortunately, financial restraints forced me to give up the arrangement, and after 2 months I moved back to the former matrimonial home where, although I no longer shared a bedroom with Tim, my life with him returned to everything it had been before. Tim continued to abuse me, and I did all the domestic duties expected of a housewife. I often fled to my room, which became both my sanctuary and my prison. At times, I locked myself in there, running from Tim. On other occasions, Tim ordered me to my room. During the period December 2006 to January 2007, Tim took leave and spent a great deal of his spare time drinking with friends. This caused me so much anxiety because I didn't know when he'd return home or what mood he'd be in when he returned. Although my doctor prescribed anti-anxiety medication for me, I thought it'd be best to escape my domestic situation and to seek professional help. I contacted my medical aid fund, and they said they were prepared to pay for another course of treatment at the same clinic that I went to previously.
An article by the Psychological Society of South Africa describes some of the psychological effects that victims of gender-based violence experience. The article reads, "There are a multitude of mental health conditions that may affect abused women, including depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, and substance use disorder. These conditions significantly increase the risk of attempted or completed suicide among women." After Kerry got confirmation that her medical aid would pay the bill for her admission, she worked up the courage to tell Tim.
I eventually plucked up the courage to tell him that I had contacted my medical aid and that they'd agreed to pay for treatment for my anxiety at the clinic in George. Oh. On hearing this, Tim erupted. He verbally abused me using foul and offensive language, calling me names, telling me that I was born mad and that I'd die mad. He jumped up from where he was sitting, grabbed me by the throat, and began to hit me. When my dog jumped up, it drew Tim's attention away from me. He released me in order to chase it out the room. I seized the moment to make my escape, ran up to my bedroom where I locked myself in. Tim shouted after me, told me to stay in my room, and that night I'd get nothing to eat.
Later that evening, Carrie needed to get something to eat before taking her medication, but she armed herself with a pistol before leaving her room as she was afraid that Tim might attack her.
On seeing me stand in the doorway at the top of the stairs leading to the room, his reaction was both immediate and violent. He screamed that he had told me to stay in my room and that he had already told me that he'd give me nothing to eat. Holding the steak knife that he had been using, he jumped to his feet and rushed at me, shouting that he was going to kill me. And that threat seemed to be deadly serious. Fearing for my life, I instinctively raised the revolver and fired a single shot at Tim before turning and fleeing back to my room where I locked myself in. I called a friend who was a police officer. She rushed to the house to assist me. It was then that we discovered that Tim had been fatally injured.
Carrie was charged with murder in the High Court in Port Elizabeth. Her plea that she had acted lawfully in self-defense was rejected. Instead, she was convicted of culpable homicide. We all have a right to protect ourselves from harm. According to the law, if we are in imminent danger, we have the right to respond with equal force. However, many people who argue self-defense still end up behind bars. Fortunately, Carrie could afford fair legal representation. Her sentence and conviction were set aside upon appeal. But The psychological harm lingers to this day. This is Him or Me, a podcast series on the experiences of women who have faced abuse and their experiences with the South African criminal justice system. I'm your host, Lele Tutonis. The Wits Justice Project investigates human rights abuses and miscarriages of justice related to the criminal justice system. You can get in touch with us by visiting our website at www.witsjusticeproject.co.za or Wits Justice Project on Facebook and on Twitter. Special thanks to Nokukanya Mtambo for providing narration services for this episode.